Good afternoon, and welcome to the Lewy Body Dementia Association's LBD University program. I'm Angela Taylor, LBDA's Director of Programs, and your host and moderator for today's webinar. This year, we're pleased to offer a series of 3 Ask the Expert webinars. Today's expert is Dr. Daniel Kaufer, a member of LBDA's Scientific Advisory Council, who will present an introduction to clinical trials. Dr. Kaufer is an associate professor and the division chief of the Cognitive Neurology and Memory Disorders and the director of the University of North Carolina's Memory Disorder Program and co-director of the Carolina Alzheimer's Network based in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Today's webinar will begin with Dr. Kaufer's presentation, and this will be followed by a question and answer period. To submit your questions, please use the Questions tab on the control panel on your screen, and you can see that it's being pointed out for you. Please feel free to submit your questions throughout the presentation, and following the presentation, I will present your questions to Dr. Kaufer, and we'll address as many as possible in the time allotted. Please note that we will have a few live polls in today's webinar for you, so listen for your opportunity to participate. And in addition, the handout tab of your control panel contains the slides from today's presentation, and you can print those or download them for future use. We're recording today's event and we'll post it on the LBDA website. You'll be able to share it with others in just a few days, so please look for an announcement from LBDA when it's available. And now I am pleased to turn things over to our guest, Dr. Kaufer.
Thank you very much, Angela. First of all, I'd like to thank everybody for attending here. It's really an honor and a privilege to be able to talk about this subject today. Before we get into the content of Introduction to Clinical Trials, I'd like you to take a poll. If you look at the screen, there are a number of questions about who is in the audience today, and we'd like to get a sense of how many of you are friends or family members of someone with LBD, if you are a person with LBD, if you're a healthcare professional that's affiliated with a clinic or a hospital or with a long-term care facility. So if you could take a minute to answer that poll, we'd appreciate that.
We will be closing the poll soon. We're at 78% who voted. Okay.
And then we'll show the results.
84% of the audience voted.
Okay, so, well, there it is. In the audience today, about 25% of the subjects are a person with LBD, which is good to see. 88%, the vast majority, are friends or family members of someone with LBD. And we have a few healthcare professionals as well. Now, to turn to the content, this presentation will be divided into 2 main parts. One part will be a general overview of clinical trials and clinical research, and then the second part will be a more personalized, what do you need to know in order to navigate a clinical trial? So as an overview to that, I'll talk about what is a clinical trial, what are the benefits, what are the challenges of participating in them, how are they run, who runs them, what's an IRB or Institutional Review Board, what's informed consent, what costs may be covered or not covered in a trial, what data that may be obtained in the trial would be available to you or not, and how do you find a clinical trial. So how does clinical research differ from clinical care? You're all familiar with how clinical care works. Clinical research basically involves human subjects participating in a study protocol that is designed to answer a specific question that contributes to medical knowledge. Clinical trials are meant for research, not to get access to a treatment that's been proven. If it's been proven to be effective, you don't need to be in a clinical trial. One of the really important take-home points from this presentation, in my opinion, is that the only legitimate pathway for developing a new, safe, and effective treatment for any medical disorder or condition is through clinical research involving a clinical trial. So if anybody is motivated to get better treatments, and I think we all are, then the only way to do it is through clinical trial participation. in general, there are two main types of clinical research studies: an observational study, which may look at a health care outcome, such as what is the effect of someone's natural diet on an outcome such as stroke or heart disease. That does not involve an intervention, where interventional trials, which in effect all clinical trials are, evaluates or compares one or more therapeutic interventions for safety and potential benefits. The reasons for conducting a clinical study there are several. One is to potentially prevent a condition or develop a diagnostic test for a condition. Another is to explore ways to improve quality of life and support care for people with a chronic illness. But the main focus today is going to be on clinical trials that evaluate one or more interventions for treating a disease or disorder. In the next slide, this is an overview of the drug development process for human disease. This is another very important area that I'd like to emphasize, because I think there's a lot of lack of understanding in the whole process and what it takes. In general, there are two main phases: a preclinical phase and a clinical phase. The preclinical phase involves identifying a potential treatment, usually based on laboratory studies in petri dishes and so forth. And then if a potentially useful compound or drug is discovered, then it will be tested in various animal models. Now, these studies are sometimes the kind of studies that you'll read about in the newspaper or hear about on the news. And people tend to get very excited about this. Now, and I don't mean to damper enthusiasm, but once something is shown to be effective in a laboratory animal, in effect, that inaugurates the start of the human testing or clinical trial. And the vast majority of the development process really involves clinical testing. On average, it takes about 12 years and over $1 billion to bring a drug to market. So I just want to urge caution whenever you hear or read about a potential treatment for a human disease that is being tested in a laboratory animal. You need to be very reserved, cautiously optimistic, but understanding that that's a long way from having that treatment available in the clinic. Now, just to walk through the drug development process, there are three different clinical phases. Phase 1 are very small studies, usually less than 100 subjects, which are just designed to see, is this therapy safe to use in human subjects? And these are usually done in normal human subjects. Phase 2, if a drug passes through phase 1 and is found to be relatively safe, then phase 2 studies typically involve 100 to 1,000 subjects. And the main goal here is to look at different doses of this therapy to see what is the optimal dose that maximizes potential benefit and minimizes potential risk and ensures safety. And if a drug passes through phase 2, then it will go on to the large phase 3 trials. And these are trials that typically involve several hundred to several thousand people. Another name for these trials are pivotal trials or registration trials, which means if these clinical trials show a positive effect of treatment, these data will be used to submit to the FDA for approval for that indication. One of the things I want to emphasize, in virtually every phase 3 clinical trial, you will see that the subjects are assigned by chance or randomized to receive either an active treatment, and there may be more than one dose of the active treatment available, or a placebo, and that signifies a placebo-controlled trial. And in addition, usually the subjects and most often the investigators, neither of them know if the subject's getting the active drug or the placebo, and that's referred to as double-blind. These three conditions, randomization, placebo-controlled, and double-blind, are implemented to ensure the absolute highest level of objectivity to make sure whatever drug effects we see are really due to the drug and not due to our hopeful expectations. For registration purposes, if a drug is shown to be safe and effective in a phase 3 trial or more than one phase 3 trial, then all the clinical trial data that's been accumulated, both in animals and humans, will be submitted to the FDA as a new drug application. And the FDA will review the application, and either ask for more information or grant approval for this. And typically, when a drug is approved, it's approved for a very specific indication. So let's take, for example, medications that are approved for Alzheimer's disease. These include donepezil, galantamine, rivastigmine, and memantine. Interestingly, all of those medications are approved not just for Alzheimer's disease, but specific stages of Alzheimer's disease, such as mild to moderate or moderate to severe. So in that case of Alzheimer's disease, severity is a secondary criteria for the indication based on the studies that were done. And one of the things that illustrates is how narrow the criteria can be for some of these phase 3 pivotal trials. So for example, to get an indication for mild to moderate subjects, the study included only subjects who had mild to moderate disease. And that just illustrates that there often are restrictions on eligibility for given trials, which is something that I think we need to be, you need to pay very close attention to. Now, if you look at the range of therapeutic interventions, there are two main classes. The one we're talking about here today primarily are FDA-registered therapies, and these are referred to as pharmaceutical agents. They could be devices as well as drugs or pharmaceuticals, but for all intents and purposes today we're focusing on pharmaceutical agents. In order to get registered through the FDA, these potential treatments have to go through the rigorous process that I just described, double-blind, placebo-controlled trials to demonstrate safety, efficacy, and having been done in a way that adheres to ethical standards. Now, on the other side are vitamins and herbal supplements, and these are sometimes referred to as nutraceuticals, and these are regulated in a very different way. The labeling for these different supplements or nutraceuticals cannot specify that it's used to treat a specific medical condition. It may improve cognitive function, but it can't say it's improving cognitive function for this disorder or that disorder. And I think the biggest caution I would urge in exploring the use of vitamins or herbal supplements is that most of these agents have not been rigorously tested for either efficacy or safety. And things that you may see advertised on TV or in a magazine or the internet, those are ones where they may refer to some clinical data, but typically that's not the large phase 3 double-blind placebo-controlled randomized clinical trial. So I would just urge caution in pursuing treatments in the nutraceutical world. Now, in terms of therapeutic interventions for neurodegenerative disorders in particular, there are two main classes that are important to distinguish. Up until now, the only type of treatment that's been approved are what are called symptomatic therapies. Another term for this is palliative. What that means is that the goal of these treatments is to alleviate one or more signs or symptoms associated with the disease. So, for example, the treatments that are approved by the FDA to treat Alzheimer's disease are approved to treat cognitive symptoms in that disorder. That's the primary indication. Now, one of the important aspects of symptomatic treatment is that the benefit of the treatment begins and ends with exposure to the treatment, which in effect means that there is no cumulative effect that builds up over time, so that once a person stops that medication within a few weeks, it will be as if they had never been exposed to that medication. And in contrast, one of the areas that is gaining a lot of attention now that we're all very interested in is having the availability of agents that actually modify the underlying disease process. So these are types of treatments that are intended to either slow down or halt the progression of a disease or even potentially reverse decline that's already occurred. And in this case, the potential benefit would be cumulative, or in that once exposure has stopped to that, you would still retain some of the benefit of disease modification that had accrued over time. So I think moving forward in the future, you will hopefully hear more and more about disease-modifying clinical trials. So now turning to who conducts clinical trials. Well, most clinical trials are conducted by a medical doctor. and includes a research team of doctors, nurses, social workers, and other healthcare professionals. The sponsors for the clinical studies are primarily either the federal government through NIH or the Department of Veterans Affairs, or through large pharmaceutical companies or academic medical centers or other nonprofit agencies and foundations. Where are they conducted? In general, I think there are three main types of venues where clinical trials are conducted. One is an academic research center where clinical trials are conducted often in conjunction with other types of research that may be focused on identifying diagnostic tests or investigating other aspects of a disease other than therapeutic interventions. There are also community-based clinical trial centers that primarily focus on clinical trials that may or may not provide clinical care along with that focus on clinical trials. And then third are private practices that are primarily focused on providing clinical care, but will do one or a few clinical trials on the side. Now, it's important to understand what an institutional review board is, because any clinical trial that is available will have to be approved by an institutional review board. This board is made up of doctors, researchers, and members of the community who review the study protocol. So basically, the board consists of representatives of people, the doctors, the researchers, and representatives from the community who basically represent potential subjects who might be interested in participating. The purpose of the IRB is to ensure that whatever risks are involved in the study are minimized as much as possible, and that they are reasonable in relation to what the expected level of potential benefit might be. These IRBs review, approve, and monitor all clinical research studies. They also review the informed consent document to make sure that it's understandable and clearly describes the risks and benefits of the study. I happen to serve on our local IRB board, and one of the things that we often do is tell researchers, investigators to cut the jargon out of their informed consent so that people, normal, regular, everyday people can understand what the study is about. Now, to turn to informed consent. This is one of the most important documents involved in the clinical trial. This provides potential and enrolled participants information about the clinical study. And the main purpose of informed consent is to help a person make an informed decision about whether or not they want to participate in the study based on what's known about the risks and what's known about the potential benefits and what other alternatives there may be to participating in this clinical trial. A person must sign an informed consent document before participating in any aspect of a research study, but signing the document and providing consent is not considered to be a legal contract. And another important aspect of any informed consent for any protocol is that participants may withdraw from a study at any time. All studies are conducted according to a clinical study research plan. And this is designed to answer a specific research question as well as safeguard the health of participants and covers the following areas. What's the reason for conducting the study? Who is eligible for the study? How many subjects are they trying to study in whatever phase of development the treatment may be? What's the schedule of tests, procedures, or other drugs and dosages of the interventions that may be involved? How long does the study last, and what information will be gathered about the participants who partake in the study? So now I'd like to turn to kind of a review of what people considering being involved in a clinical trial will go through in terms of evaluating, is this something that I want to be involved in? So the basics of any clinical trial is what is being studied, what's the therapeutic rationale, why does it make sense that this treatment might be beneficial, and also what do we know about possible treatment effects, both good and bad. And there are some studies that involve agents that there's relatively little data from human studies, whereas in other studies there may be a drug that's approved for another indication where we know a lot about its safety and potential efficacy, but then we're trying to develop a new indication for it, and in that case, we'll know a lot more about what to expect than compared to a drug where we know very little. Eligibility is really one of the most important aspects of a study, and in my experience, it's one that can be a source of disappointment for people who, once they hear about a clinical study, become very excited and very optimistic about participating, only to find out later that for whatever reason, they don't meet the inclusion or exclusion criteria for that study. And that's just the way things are. In conducting clinical trials, they have to balance representing what are patients like in the real world, getting a representative sample of patients, but in order to maintain the integrity of the study, of the data collected in the study, they want to make sure that there aren't too many confounding variables, like other medical conditions that may interfere with the treatment, or other medications that may have interactions with some of the study drugs. So for a variety of reasons, every trial has inclusion criteria, often involving age, what the diagnosis is, how severe the disease may be, as well as exclusion criteria, which is really designed to limit the number of confounding variables that may interfere with getting a good evaluation of that potential treatment. So this is a warning that some clinical trials are very wide open to a wide range of individuals with a given disease, where other trials may just be looking at a specific stage of the disease or for a specific symptom associated with a disease. Another important aspect of trials is to understand what are the possible interventions, and we refer to this as treatment arms. So at bare minimum, in a placebo-controlled trial, we'll have a placebo group and a treatment group, but there often is different treatment groups where different doses of the same treatment may be studied. There's an advantage to that from a participant's point of view. If you're involved in a study where the randomization is 1-to-1 between, for every person that is assigned to placebo, a person is assigned to treatment, in that case, you have a 50% chance of receiving the treatment. On the other hand, if you're in a trial where there are 2 or 3 different doses of an active treatment compared to a placebo, then the chance of getting the active treatment will be 2-to-1 or 3-to-1. So there are some advantages to having available studies that test more than one dose of a given treatment. How will it be determined which intervention they receive? Usually these studies are randomized by just people, whatever the ratio is based on the number of treatment arms, those people are randomized, although there may be other variables that they use to make sure that there's an equal number of men and women in the different arms, or some other variable that they want to look at and control for, that they may randomize people to balance out that other factor as well. Now, will you know which intervention you're receiving during the trial? If the study is single-blinded or double-blinded, then that means that the participants will not know whether they're getting active treatment or placebo. The difference between a single-blind and a double-blind trial is that in a single-blind trial, the investigator will know whether or not the subject's getting the treatment, but the subject will not. There are some trials where there may be an initial phase where there is a single blind, where the investigator will know whether or not the subject's getting a treatment or placebo, but then after that initial phase, the main study are typically done as a double-blind procedure in order to maintain objectivity of the data. Another important aspect that can limit one's ability to participate in a study is what other medications they're taking. Questions like, whatever current treatments they're taking, are those medications allowed to be taken by subjects who are participating in the study? Are there any medications that they're not allowed to take? And another important aspect is, are there other treatment options available? In a case of Alzheimer's disease, if you're talking about an Alzheimer's disease study, then we have to say, well, yes, there are several drugs that are approved for treatment. But in most other neurodegenerative disorders, there aren't any approved treatments. So having the determination of whether or not there are other approved treatments available can also affect eligibility for a clinical trial. Study requirements. What does the person have to do to participate? And in neurodegenerative disorders, a study partner is typically required. What tests or procedures are involved? How often do they have to visit the hospital or clinic? And when people come from farther away or due to study demands, will they have to stay overnight? And usually when that does occur, that the study will pay the expenses for the overnight stay. And then what is the overall duration of the study? In terms of costs or payments, there's a distinction between an experimental intervention and what is a standard of care. In virtually all clinical trials, if there is a medication involved, that will be provided free of charge. If the therapeutic intervention that's being studied, that will be paid for and provided for free. There may be procedures that somebody would go through as part of a standard of care, and those procedures are often billed to third-party insurers or Medicare, whereas any experimental procedure that would be done would typically be paid for by the sponsor. In terms of being reimbursed for other expenses, reasonable expenses associated with whatever it takes to be part of the trial usually are covered, but you need to make sure in advance that whatever expenses will be covered. Another question is who will oversee medical care? If the investigator conducting the trial is the physician the subject seen, then that's straightforward. But even when somebody participates in a trial, if they're being managed by another physician, those relationships are generally maintained. And it's important for investigators who are working with subjects who are being managed by other doctors to maintain communication between what goes on in the study and what is important to know from the perspective of clinical care for that subject. And lastly, what are options if you're injured during the study? Again, all IRB informed consent documents will have language in there that addresses that. And there is some variability in what a sponsor will and will not pay for, and it's just something that I would say you need to look at the details for that particular study in that particular informed consent document. In terms of follow-up or termination, what if you decide to withdraw from the study? As I said before, it is within the subject's right to withdraw from a study at any time. After a study occurs, what type of long-term follow-up care will be part of the trial or not? Many studies will have what's called an open-label extension after a double-blind placebo-controlled phase. If that may run for 6 or 12 months, there often will be available after that an open-label extension where subjects, whether or not they received active treatment or placebo during the double-blind study, after that is finished, they often are able to participate in an open-label extension study where they will definitely receive the active treatment for a specified period of time. And this also addresses the question, what if you benefit from the intervention? Well, hopefully, if that's the case, hopefully there will be an open-label extension to help maintain that benefit after the trial ends. Now, another question that often comes up that is really variable between studies is what results of the data obtained in the study will be available to the subject. And this can include clinical data that's obtained or brain imaging data or genetic testing information. And usually all the research data technically is outside of the domain of clinical care. So it would only be through certain circumstances and well-defined circumstances that any data obtained in a clinical trial would be potentially available within a general medical context. So there are general safeguards that exist to make sure that whatever data is collected in research stays in research unless there is a specific stipulation that allows certain data to be to carry over into the clinical context. And finally, just to conclude here, some very helpful resources. If you ever want to know what clinical trial is going on for whatever given disorder, the website clinicaltrials.gov is a comprehensive listing of all clinical trials in every aspect of medicine that are going on. And if you want to keep up to date, they will tell you what studies are ongoing, what have been completed, what are about to start, and they give you pretty up-to-date information about where things are for a given area. The FDA website also has a lot of useful background information about what's involved in getting a drug approved for a specific indication. And finally, the Lewy Body Dementia Association provides a lot of useful information for caregivers and for physicians involved in the care of patients with Lewy body dementia. So before we conclude the presentation part of the webinar, I ask you to refer back to the poll and to answer the following question. Rate your interest in participating in a research study or clinical trial. And the following choices are extremely interested, very interested, moderately interested, slightly interested, or not at all interested. So please take a moment to complete that.
%, 79% of the audience voted.
Okay, so let's look. We have a pretty interesting distribution here. So 28% were extremely interested, 21% very interested, 28% moderately interested, 13% slightly interested, and 10% not at all interested. I'm hoping that the not at all interested represent people who don't have a reason to be in the clinical trial. And I guess it's encouraging that at least the majority of people are at least somewhat interested in participating in a clinical trial, and close to half are very or extremely interested. So I think we can take stock of those data and hopefully provide an opportunity for clinical trial participation for all of those who are interested.
Angela?
So with that,
my apologies, I was on mute. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Kaufer. We have a number of questions that have come in from our audience, both when they registered and during the live event. So let's talk about a few of them. And I see a few trends here.
Okay.
Prior to the event, we got quite a few questions about the availability of studies specifically for the early stage of the disease, and what's the potential for people to participate in the later stage of the disease, more advanced disorders, more advanced stages. So, perhaps you could tell us a little bit about, what may be coming, or what's the potential for people to participate in research at the mild stage versus, what are the opportunities or challenges at the advanced stage?
So I think that's a really important and great question. And just as I alluded to before with Alzheimer's disease, severity was stipulated as part of the eligibility criteria for virtually all the trials that have been done. With Lewy body dementia, there have been very, very few trials that have been done in Lewy body dementia. The few that have been done have primarily focused on those with mild to moderate disease. Now, in terms of later stage disease, that is a really important group to study for different types of interventions that may be useful. However, from just simply a very practical point of view, it can be very difficult to study people with advanced disease, to have them be able to meet the demands of the study, which require being at certain times in certain places and doing certain types of assessments. So getting a person with more severe disease involved and through the demands of a clinical trial is just inherently more challenging. It's challenging to get people with mild to moderate disease through clinical trials, given all the different symptom manifestations that can occur. What I'm hoping is that we will see an explosion of opportunity to participate in different clinical trials for Lewy body dementia. The more potential subjects that we have and the more potential therapeutic interventions that we have available, then I think that could foreseeably lead to a point where we have a similar situation where what's going on, what's already occurred with Alzheimer's, where we have trials that are for very early stage individuals, and that might be the equivalent of what in Alzheimer's disease we refer to as mild cognitive impairment. Hopefully we will have treatments that will involve subjects in later stages of diseases. But again, those type of studies will have to be designed specifically to account for the increasing severity of the disease and just the limitations that a subject and a caregiver informant would have in being able to reliably do whatever is required by the study. I think as more and more people become involved and as interest in this area grows, which I see it happening day by day, I'm hopeful that there will be many, many more clinical trial opportunities that will cover the whole spectrum of the disease.
All right, thank you very much. Another area where we have some commonality in is about the availability and of test results and what type of testing may be involved. So can you share a little bit about what kinds of potential tests might be part of a clinical trial, and what is the thinking behind why that isn't readily available to the participant afterwards?
So, and I think this gets back to, thank you, I think that's a really excellent question. And to answer that, I'd like to go back and reference the distinction I made previously between a symptomatic or palliative treatment and a disease-modifying treatment. If you're studying a potential treatment that is focused on treating a symptom associated with the disease, then the primary focus of the evaluation will be to make sure that the person has the disorder that's being studied and that there's some clinical assessment that is reliable and valid for assessing the effect of a treatment on that particular sign or symptom. In those kinds of studies, the types of imaging or genetics or CSF studies are not terribly important. Whereas if you're talking about a disease-modifying intervention, that is where what are called biomarkers, which are in the process of being developed for Lewy body dementia, will play a very important role. And in fact, I think one of the limiting factors for doing a disease-modifying trial is to have a reliable biomarker that measures disease progression and therefore the ability of a treatment to modify that disease progression. So I think for right now, for Lewy body dementia, we don't have well-validated biomarkers, although there is a lot of work going on in that area, and hopefully within the not-too-distant future, those types of biomarkers will be available. And I think that is one of the limiting factors about our limited ability to do a disease-modifying clinical trial now, because we don't have these markers available to validly measure disease progression. Now, in terms of data that's available, let me give an example within the Alzheimer's world, because there's a lot more data from there and a lot more experience, and I think ultimately what's happened in the Alzheimer's world is going to inform what happens in the arena of Lewy body dementia. So one of the variables that is virtually always measured in a clinical trial of patients with Alzheimer's disease is a gene called apolipoprotein E, or ApoE. And the reason it's measured is because there's one variant of that gene called the E4 allele that's associated with a higher risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. And there's also evidence that it may affect how well or not a person responds to a given treatment. And so having people who are either E4 positive or E4 negative is something that every clinical trial in Alzheimer's disease has collected. They've collected that data, but I'm not aware of any where that genetic data has been made available in the clinical domain, in large part because there's nothing that's at this current time clinically relevant about that. Now, if there was a treatment approved for Alzheimer's disease that was shown to be effective only in patients who didn't have an E4 or who did have an E4, then that information would be clinically relevant and would be important to have. So that might be a situation where data collected as part of a study could be made available within a clinical context. But I think one of the key defining features above and beyond safety, I think safety in terms of not physical health, but just protecting the rights and confidentiality of the individual, safety from that point of view. I think what the clinical relevance of the data is, if it's not that clinically relevant to the current prevailing circumstances, then having that information available clinically really doesn't change anything that would be done. So I think there's the data that's collected is often used for experimental purposes, investigational purposes that down the road may have some value, but at the present wouldn't necessarily have any value to treating that person in the current climate of clinical care.
Very helpful, very helpful. So I have a good question about informed consent. If a person is no longer capable of making their own decisions and they have appointed somebody with a medical power of attorney, is that caregiver who has that power of attorney able to enroll them in a clinical trial?
So that's another really important question and very interesting question. At the very least, what you would like, in most cases, when we enroll subjects who have cognitive impairment as part of a disease process into a clinical trial, we can't assume that they have full capacity to make a voluntary decision about whether or not they can participate. Now, that's not saying they can't understand some of what's going on in the study or even most of what's going on in the study, but we just can't assume that they are in and of themselves capable of providing valid informed consent. So we routinely involve the informant, or the term is legally appointed representative, LAR, that they will also complete they will co-sign or sign, basically give proxy consent for participation in whatever clinical trial. From the subject's point of view, we would very much like to have assent. We're certainly not going to force somebody to do a trial, even if their legally appointed representative wants them to do a trial. If that subject clearly is adamant about not being in the clinical trial, then we certainly will not force that issue. But at the very least, even if somebody cannot provide informed consent in an expected full capacity, we still go through the process of explaining all the requirements of the study, all the risks and all the benefits, to both the legally appointed representative and the subject themselves, assuming that they have a right to know about all the potential risks and benefits, and usually they can understand a fair amount in that as well. But I think routinely, to answer the question, that in order to conduct a clinical trial in a disease where cognitive impairment is presumed, you need a proxy informed consent from a legally appointed representative, and at least nominally you would like assent from the subject. They have to sign the document too as well. So it can't be done without their signing the informed consent as well. So if they refuse to sign the informed consent, then they can't be in the study.
Okay. Very important information for us all to understand. I have a couple of questions, and understandably so, about the length of time it takes to go through the full drug development process and the incredibly high cost that must be spent in order to do it. And understandably, families are frustrated because for them, anything that is in the very earliest stages may not reach that kind of phase 3 pivotal study by the time their loved one is still, at the time where they're still able to participate. So, what goes into creating that incredibly long timeline and that cost, and how much, opportunity is there to shorten both of those?
So again, that's a really important, very problematic area, and believe me, as a researcher in the field, we feel this as much as the patients and families do, and we're frustrated by that as well. The most simple answer I can offer to that is that treating degenerative brain disorders is not an easy feat to do, and it's a very complicated process. And part of the problem is that when you compare it to other areas of medicine, and this is a simple example, if you're trying to develop a treatment for high blood pressure, and you want to study a potential treatment for hypertension, you know what the outcome measure is. It's taking a blood pressure. That's pretty simple and straightforward. But if you want to study a potential intervention for Alzheimer's disease, for example, well, then you're going to want to look at cognitive functioning, and the FDA requires looking at a core feature of the disease. And in Alzheimer's disease, that's memory and other cognitive difficulties, and that's pretty much a given for people with Alzheimer's disease. So the clinical trials that have evolved over the last 20 years have typically involved a standardized cognitive test battery, as well as what's called a global assessment of outcome. So one is a very objective, narrow cognitive test outcome. The other is a more broad, real-world, interview the patient, interview the caregiver, how have they changed over the course of the study outcome measure. So they look at different aspects of what can we see objectively on testing and what do we see in the real world. And with Alzheimer's disease or with Parkinson's disease, if you're just evaluating the effect of a treatment on motor function, those are pretty straightforward outcome measures. On the other hand, if you're looking at somebody with Lewy body dementia, what do you use as the outcome measure? Well, probably a cognitive assessment, but it might be different than one used for Alzheimer's disease because the types of cognitive symptoms that people with Lewy body dementia have are different than the kind that people with Alzheimer's have. Do you measure hallucinations? Do you measure sleep problems? Do you measure motor Parkinsonism? Do you measure autonomic dysfunction? Are those appropriate outcome measures? I think one of the challenges in the field of Lewy body dementia is to how do you design appropriate outcome measures for a study to evaluate a given therapeutic intervention. And I say that it's a work in progress right now. There just haven't been that many clinical trials that have come to fruition in Lewy body dementia. And I'll go back to the year 2000 when the first large clinical trial that I'm aware of was published in Lewy body dementia. And that trial looked at, which was with rivastigmine, looked at behavioral symptoms, neuropsychiatric symptoms as the primary outcome measure. And there's a reason where that might make sense in patients who have psychosis or anxiety or other neuropsychiatric manifestations. So one of the problems inherent in this type of disease process, when you have multiple dimensions of clinical signs and symptoms, designing an outcome measure that reliably measures change over time in all these different areas or in a select few of these areas, and also defining an intervention that addresses one or more of these different symptom complexes. So just inherently, it's a little bit more complicated, I think, in Lewy body dementia, given that there are many more facets of functioning that are often involved in the different disease. And right now, there are a few studies ongoing that instead of there are some studies looking at Lewy body dementia from a more global perspective, but there are other studies that are looking at specific features like what is the effect of a treatment on hallucinations or what is the effect of a treatment on REM sleep behavior disorder. And I think ultimately we're going to need both types of these studies, as well as obviously disease-modifying studies that will look at more likely look at the biomarkers than look at this or that clinical sign and symptom. And in fact, when you have such a diverse array of clinical signs and symptoms to target from a clinical therapeutic point of view, that makes it all the more desirable, I think, to have a biomarker available that can be more objective in the context of evaluating potentially disease-modifying therapy. So we clearly need to move on to that level as soon as we can, but for the time being, I think just making headway with having treatments that can effectively treat whatever symptoms occur would still be a big improvement over the status quo. In terms of getting back to what can we do about it, I think the FDA is well aware of this, and I think they are kind of refocusing their requirements for what do we need to do to make sure that we have an effective and safe therapy. And I emphasize safety because there's no compromising safety. That's just not something that's not negotiable. But in terms of what's the bar for how much effect, how much improvement we need to see, or how much of a positive therapeutic effect we need to see, I think the FDA is cutting back what they require based on that there hasn't been very much movement in the field over a long period of time. And I think just to make some progress now to get some momentum going, I think will help accelerate our ability to get therapies into clinical trials that will have the potential to provide more benefit than the ones that we're working with now. So I'm hoping, just to tie this up, that if we can get enough momentum going, that we can really get the therapeutic field in Lewy body dementia to take off and to get us a lot closer. I don't think this is going to be a linear time, year-by-year thing, but if we can get the momentum and get a lot of people involved in a lot of different trials, I think that's what we need to do in order to get closer to having more treatments available.
Great. We have a couple of questions that tie to safety and the fact that these are experimental drugs. Do you consider these, clinical trials, phase 1, 2, and 3, are these drugs experimental? Should a person have their physician approve their participation in that clinical trial? And how do individuals get the results of the phase 1 or phase 2 studies so that they know a little bit more about what they might be facing?
So again, those are all really good questions. I think if there's any doubt about whether or not it is safe for a potential subject to participate in a trial, I would hope that whatever investigator is involved in the trial would exercise caution if that's demanded based on the clinical characteristics of a given subject. Now, the study protocols themselves often, if there is some obvious safety issue, that is typically part of the exclusion criteria for a study. So I would say the first step is that those are generally built into the studies themselves. If there is anything that's easily identifiable as a potential safety concern, that those people will be excluded from the study up front. Now, beyond that, if there's any question, I think it makes perfect sense for a subject to consult with their own private physician to get their sense of whether or not it would be reasonable to participate in a given trial. I think that's something that I think is generally, this is what IRBs spend a lot of time doing, is making sure that the safety issues involved with patient participation are there and in place, so to leave as little as possible up to discretion of either investigators or whether or not someone's eligible for a study. Now, in terms of phase 1 or phase 2, there is part of any informed consent, and this is the really boring part of informed consent. There are often tables that will list, here are the adverse events that we're seeing in all the previous trials of this potential treatment. And they typically list them, which ones occurred in more than 5% of the people, which ones occurred in less than 5%, and which, if any, were associated with serious adverse events. So again, this information is part of the informed consent process. And whatever safety issues have been identified, it's the IRB's obligation to make sure that whatever safety risks are in play are clearly communicated within the informed consent document so that a potential subject and their family can make an informed decision about whether or not it makes sense for them to participate. And there's a lot of individual variability on this. Some people will say, hey, if I have access to a potentially game-changing treatment, I'm willing to risk a lot for it. Where there are other people who are more risk-averse and say, you know, sorry, that's not for me. And so that's really, at the end of the day, that boils down to an individual decision about making an informed choice about what the risk and what the potential benefits are, and then deciding whether or not to proceed.
Okay. Probably the most popular question that we got was, is there a study for X symptom in LBD, or a study in my town, or a study for somebody who might have, you know, LBD but may have this particular comorbid condition? Again, can you tell everybody where they can go to find a full list of clinical trials so that they can determine for themselves what their options might be?
Sure. And again, in the last slide of my presentation, the website clinicaltrials.gov, which is run by the government, that is a very comprehensive list of every clinical trial that is going on in the developed world for all intents and purposes. So, and there is a search bar there where you can type in Lewy body dementia, or if you want to look for specific subtypes or specific symptoms like RBD or hallucinations, you can plug that into the search and it will show you everything like Lewy body and hallucination, and that will show you any trial that has anything to do with those parameters. So again, I would refer people for a very up-to-date and comprehensive list of whatever clinical trials are available, and each clinical trial will list whatever sites are participating in that trial and provide the contact information for that site. So if you ever want to know what's available for what drug, for what target symptom, in what location of the country, clinicaltrials.gov is the place to go.
Fantastic. We had one question that came in from a healthcare professional. What are some effective strategies for enrolling patients into LBD clinical trials?
So I think to enroll patients in clinical trials, what helps a lot is to understand the disease process, to be able to readily diagnose and manage the disease, and to feel comfortable with it. And I think from a potential participant's point of view, that what they would like to see from the investigator is that they're knowledgeable about this disorder, they have experience with it, and that they have an even-handed approach to offering participation in the study. It's voluntary, and one of the things that, again, the IRB pays very close attention to in evaluating any study, they place a premium on making sure that there's no coercion on the part of the investigator to get a person into a given trial or not. So I think from a potential subject's point of view, you would like an investigator who knows about the disorder, is comfortable with it, can explain it to them, can really go through the risks and benefits and help that subject make an informed decision without them feeling that, gee, they're trying to get me in the study for whatever reason where I don't think this is the right thing for me. So I think there's a personal comfort level that just, and one of the things that I really enjoy about being a clinical trial investigator is that in many ways that gives me an opportunity to spend more time with the patients and family. Just in the course of executing the study, I spend more time with them and they spend more time with me, and I get to know them better and they learn more about the disease. And I view clinical trial participation is a real partnership, that we both have a common goal, and the way to move this forward is to work together.
And I think that is the perfect note for us to end on. Thank you once again, Dr. Kaufer, for your very interesting and informative presentation and for making time to join us today. And I'd like to thank everybody else who joined us. Today's event was sponsored by an unrestricted educational grant from Axovant Sciences. Most LBDA programs are made possible through generous donations. So if you'd like to make a gift, please visit our website, lbda.org. I hope that you'll join us again on September 7th at 2 p.m. Eastern when Dr. James Leverance, Director of the Cleveland Clinic Lou Ruvo Center for Brain Health and the Joseph Hahn, MD, Endowed Chair of the Neurological Institute at the Cleveland Clinic, will present an update on LBD research. So thank you again for joining us, and I hope that you all have a great day.
Thank you.